Welcome to week 3, chapters 7 and 9 in our primary text. Chapters focus on theories designed to appreciate the impact that legacy, or sometimes known as traditional media, have in characterizing a crisis and distributing information to an anxious public. Now keep in mind, in spite of all the social media that we're on all day, every day, traditional media continues to be the central players that still offer the most relevant and the most authoritative sources of information. And this becomes even more true during a crisis. So a lot of the news that you see in your news feed, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or whatever social media platform, a lot of the news comes from still those traditional news sources. And I encourage folks to still rely upon traditional media, authoritative sources when you're looking for information that can be trusted. Those media that can be, that follow the basic principles of journalism. Okay. Your authors talk about how the media are such central players in crisis communication that people are strongly encouraged to form partnerships or relationships with the media before a crisis occurs. The first time you want to talk to media is not when a crisis is brewing, right? You want to establish those relationships well in advance. This has been the case for most military public affairs officers. When I was a Pentagon press officer, you walked out my back door across the hallway and you were in the Pentagon press corps. And they did the same thing. They walked out their back door and they were in the Pentagon press office. We traveled with them. We worked with them day to day. And so when we had crises, and there were obviously many of them, it wasn't the first time we were dealing with these folks. We had built up a relationship. Now, it's an adversarial relationship, as it should be in a free society. They're not there to take the information we have at will and spew it back out. They're there to challenge us and to ensure that the information we put out is accurate, is timely, it has some context, all those things. And so that relationship with media is key. Now, from their inception, the media have played a central role in crisis communication because they're actively seeking out information based upon what their audience is interested in, and their audience depends upon that traditional media to understand the events at hand. Now, because media communication plays a primary role in distributing information during and even after crisis, several theories have been dedicated to analyzing the media. Some of these are framing, uses and gratification, agenda setting, and many others. Now, we're not going to review all these for the sake of time. I know you don't want to sit here watching me on a video, bore you with all the different theories, although I find them exciting. I'm going to discuss one, and that's framing. Framing helps us better understand how a story is depicted by the media. The idea is that people do not wait to be told what sounds authoritative or what framing means, right? So there's only so much space. Even though we're beyond the days of printed newspapers and other things that kind of limit it that way, there's still only so much space online in terms of attention space, right? So, for example, if you were to look at a newspaper in a newspaper stand, which we still have, you want to see what is above the fold. What photo, what story, what text is above the fold. Well, we still have that online, except instead of above the fold, we call it above the scroll, right? So if I were to log into a traditional media news site, what is going to be the first story that I see? And that still plays today. What photo is used? What lead is used? What is up front in the story? What is pushed down further in the story? All that has to do with the theory of framing, and it impacts the information that readers or viewers get. Okay, the authors see continuous expansion of mobile communication technology as an opportunity to enhance crisis communication. And this is so true. I mean, think about it. Going back decades, it was very rare for there to be news available when you wanted it, anytime during the day. 30 news channels, and they aired their worldly news or the world news in the evening. You get your local news a few more times than that. Maybe you're from a bigger city, you had news at noon, maybe a little morning show, but it wasn't like you had instant access to communication. Now, we do now. But just because there's more information doesn't mean it's better. And so it's even more important for those of us in the communication business to make sure that we're using all the tools available to make sure that we are getting the accurate and timely information out. All right, so there are lots of theories in the chapters. Another one I'll quickly touch on is what's known as apologia. This focuses on the response strategies available to individuals and organizations when their actions violate commonly held public values. Okay, so there may be a situation in which you didn't just have a disaster, but the disaster was such that it touched on these commonly held public values, and so that brings it up to a whole nother level. All right, so each of these theories discussed, they offer kind of a lens for us to analyze or evaluate persuasive communication, especially that communication that's delivered in a crisis. But again, don't get bogged down with the theory. Cite it, use it, make sure you're applying it in your discussion post and your assignments. But more importantly, think about how you would be able to use that theory. It's that applied learning that we're most interested in. Okay, a few supplemental readings this week. We'll start with Boyd talking about actional legitimation, saying that there's no crisis necessary, right? The research shows that there is a difference between institutional and actionable legitimacy. Delving a little bit further, although institutional legitimacy has basically formed a basis for studies of crisis communication. Think about image, values advocacy, issue management, actionable legitimacy. They allow for the day-to-day or more public relations activities that we do in and out throughout the day. And we incorporate those as part of our organizational policy, right? Hopefully you've got a communication plan that drives strategy or helps support strategy. You're going to have a crisis communication plan that, if things happen that want to take us off our normal path, usually due to things outside of our control, what do we do with that? That's a little bit different part, and that's the whole purpose of this course, is to help you with that. The authors also talk about how institutions, whether they're government, corporate, nonprofit, they gain or lose legitimacy based upon the perceptions of their stakeholders. Again, it's not about what you say about the organization, it's what your stakeholders perceive about your organization. That's why it's so crucial for you to understand your stakeholders. What do they know? How do they communicate? What do they need to know in order to better understand or appreciate the value that you offer or how you're dealing with this crisis? Okay, Seeger 2007 talks about some best practices in crisis communication. The purpose of the analysis was to describe some best practices specifically related to crisis communication. It's why we kept with this article, even though it's a little bit dated, because there's just so much good practical knowledge. This was an expert panel process that they used, and they found that there's some basic principles, not just based upon anecdotal observations, but also experiences and extended case study analysis, also some empirical investigation of crisis and risk communication. You'll find the 10 best practices on pages 236 and 242 of that Seeger article. And then the 10 best practices for crisis communication, they're outlined, they're basically used as general standards rather than specific prescriptions, right? So you're not going to go in there and be able to just lift and go, oh, I'll do this when this. They just offer some good best practices for you to consider as you are writing your own crisis communication plan. All right, Kim, next article. Does corporate advertising work in a crisis? Now, some of you may have experience working with advertising. When I retired from the Navy, my first job was working for the Navy's ad agency, which was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it, did it for many years. And I appreciated how it was close enough to public affairs or public relations that I could speak the language, but it was just different enough that it kept it interesting. And I was able to learn a lot about communication through what's known as advertising or sometimes paid media as opposed to earned media, which is more on the public relations side. So corporate communication often includes public relations, corporate advertising, sponsorship, social responsible activities, all that. And there are some organizations, depending upon their size and their structure, where all of those will come under one umbrella. That was not the way it was done in the Navy. There was usually kind of a clear line between public affairs or public relations and advertising. And we did that for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is that the credibility of public affairs had to be squeaky clean, right? I mean, we are paid for by tax dollars. We are obligated by law to provide timely and accurate information to the American public, regardless of whether that information is good or bad. I mean, it has to be provided to the American public. And we do it mostly through earned media, a little bit of owned media, which is your website, and then social media. But, obviously advertising plays a role too. The only organization in the military that's authorized to advertise is Recruiting Command. So I'm back in the Navy as a Navy civilian now. We do community outreach. We are not allowed to advertise. We cannot spend any money on advertising. Only Recruiting Command is authorized to do that. But nevertheless, there still needs to be coordination. We still coordinate with Recruiting Command. Even when I served at Recruiting Command, my office was right across the hallway from the Director of Marketing and Advertising. And we like to see ourselves as kind of like two sides of the same coin. My counterpart was a swimmer, and so he used to think about, there are lane markers on the top and there are black lines on the bottom, and so we more focus on the black lines on the bottom, right? So if there were times where we kind of, swum into each other's lane, it's not that big a deal. As long as we kept each other informed and as long as we were working together for that common mission. Okay, so when you think about a crisis, whatever the issue happens to be, it usually brings a great deal of publicity, and not in a good way, typically. It's a crisis situation that can be managed best with open relationships with each sector of the public: mass media, employees, stockholders, the government, the public at large, environmental groups, social action groups. All those things need to be open, honest, and most importantly, built upon a relationship, hopefully, that you've already established. Okay? All right. Next article, Augur. Trust me not. This is an experimental analysis of the effects of transparency on an organization. I just hinted at the importance of open and honest communication, which of course is related directly to transparency. The purpose of the study was to examine the effect of transparency on trust, and to examine the effect of transparency on the positive behavioral intentions of stakeholders. Now keep in mind, trust is fragile. It is set in uncertainty, and it's influenced by the stakeholders' perception. So you may think you're the most trustful organization in the world, but if your stakeholders have a different perception, then you have some work to do, right? In terms of competency, integrity, goodwill, all those things that show you're trustworthy as opposed to just saying I'm trustworthy. Now, transparency as part of the crisis communication will help restore trust and hopefully to help diminish reputational risk or damage over the long term. In order for that to happen, the organization has to be willing to listen, they have to be open, and they have to care. It's not just about saying, it's more about doing, right? Okay, that's it for this week. As always, I'll remind you to stay ahead with your assignments, stay engaged in the discussion board, and most importantly, enjoy your time of learning.